real bee society, as opposed to the society shown in the movie, is reproductively totalitarian. Most bees have very few options in life. They don't get to be for very long. They just have a very long lifespan. And their lives are quite different from what honey symbolizes. Honey symbolizes being adored, being loved, being superlative, the best of something, and being immortal. And bees don't typically have these options. Most of them don't have any opportunity to reproduce at all. The queen bee gives birth to almost all the children in the hive, making the whole hive essentially siblings and half siblings. And the drones are more or less clones if they all come from the queen. So if this were done properly, the males would look alike. And they don't have a lot of socialization options because they're all so closely related. It would be an interesting movie to see it done with the true level of sibling rivalry that would actually exist in a hive where there's only one mother. The fathers have all died during mating, and everyone is either brother or sister or half brother or sister of everybody else. You can imagine the level of competition that would involve between siblings. And it would be an interesting dialogue, but not the one shown in the movie. There is a huge amount of switching of roles in that most bees are actually female. There are only a handful of drones, just enough there to keep genetic diversity for mating purposes. The drones don't do any work. So the idea of having a male bee growing up and having to choose from all these jobs is nothing like what bees actually do. The only real job drones have is heating or cooling, flapping their wings. They don't do any of the other worker jobs, including going out to forage for honey, which is Barry's goal. So the apparently male worker bees who go out pollen jockeying are really females. And Barry is aspiring to take on the role of a job actually done by females in a real hive. This makes the whole thing very gender confused. The mosquito, who's a friend of Barry, is another example of this confusion. Male mosquitoes don't drink blood, so he's chasing after something that essentially makes him a female imitator. And when the bees want to look for mates, it's not a very romantic thing at all, because in the hive there's no one to look for, and no one hardly ever leaves the hive except for the queen and a few foragers, and a lawyer if you go out and become one. This means that all the meanings of honey, being adored, being immortal, being the best of something, are only symbolic, and Adam is part of this confusion when he says our honey is the best thing in the world. If you look up in the dictionary, honey is something used as an expression to say the best, but it might not be literal. And the bees are constantly confusing the symbol for the reality. And getting the symbol through their lawsuit, getting their honey back, does not mean that it addresses any of the basic inequities in their society. Bee queens live far longer than the rest of the bees. They can live up to 5 or 6 years. A worker will typically live only 5 or 6 weeks in the summertime, maybe 5 or 6 months if it's there through the winter. A drone might live a couple of months. But if they're there at the end of summer, they're kicked out of the hive because they don't do any breeding in the winter and they're left to die. If they're one of the few drones successful in breeding, as implied in the scene where Adam stings the opposing lawyer, that's generally fatal for them. The stinging as depicted in the movie is not right. All the stinging is usually done by worker female bees. And the males do have an appendage, which is used for mating, but they meet a similar fate when using it as to what the females do if they sting a thick-skinned animal like a mammal. If a female bee designed to fight off other insects with its stinger stings a large animal like us instead, the stinger sticks, and when the bee tries to pull out, some of its abdomen organs will go with it. So it's generally fatal, and the males suffer a similar fate. So I guess in some ways you can't blame the bees for wanting to strike up relationships with other species, but their own life is anything but romantic. There's a special code for each time this happens in the movie. When a bee is seeking out a relationship or some other insect is seeking out a relationship with a human as a substitute for what they can't get in bee life, there's a fade in, a cross fading in the transitions between scenes. So when Barry's about to talk to Vanessa for the first time, he's sitting outside her window. There's a crossfade that takes up some of the time span. When he's told to start thinking B, there's another crossfade just before he starts fantasizing about teaching Vanessa to fly. And when the rest of the hive has their own downtime, when they've gotten their whole honey supply back, they do a similar thing to Barry in that they spend 3 days lying around by the pool. And there are several crossfades in that sequence, at the end of which we're told by Adam that Uncle Carl has run off to San Antonio with a cricket. At the end of the movie, there's another series of crossfades during the final song. And that ends with Barry calling Vanessa a pet name, Vanny, and the revelation from their sign that they've gone into business together, formed another sort of partnership and another change in their relationship. When there is a seeking out of a bee of a relationship with a human, then you have these cross referencings. And one of the relationships that Barry forms is with the mosquito. And there's a crossfade when they're inside the horn in the moving truck and they start talking. And the mosquito talks about female mosquitoes not wanting male mosquitoes and wanting to trade up and get with moths or dragonflies. This is not something that a male mosquito would be talking about in that way he does, because male mosquitoes don't drink blood. They are pollinators. They are nectar drinkers, the same as bees. And so he's taking on the role of a female when he says that he wants to go out and drink blood. They're also not as much in exclusivity of pollination as far as bees are concerned, because not only because other insects do it, but because wind pollinates grass and trees. So the trees at the end and the grass at the end are not showing the way things would really happen if there were a lack of pollination by honeybees, because they wouldn't be affected. So there's this tension between being and longing, or yearning, as Barry says. The bees are constantly yearning for something which is not anatomically possible, or they seek out relationships which do not result in viable offspring. And this is something that if we want to emulate bees and hold up bees as a model for how human society should work, that we should be aware of, because it shouldn't be desirable for a human society to have no equality of opportunity in terms of reproduction, so that people, in trying to imitate bees, might come to be like them, and in constantly trying to switch gender roles, become infertile and incapable of producing their own children. The whole aim of the lawsuit should be to address these inequities in bee society, that the queen lives maybe 50 times as long as one of the workers in the summertime. And Larry King apparently is a reference to this, that people in media try to take on the fame or the stature of the people they interview to appear as in equals when they talk to them. So B. Larry King appears at least to be old, to have a human lifespan. Whether this is true or not, we don't know, because Barry asks him how old he is, but he doesn't say. So there's this opposite meaning. To belong, to be part of the hive, means to serve the interests of the hive and live only as long as the hive requires you to live. Workers would live a few weeks, for instance, in the summertime, and then if they are there over the winter, they can live 5 or 6 months to span the winter time. And it could be disastrous in the movie for the bees to win their honey settlement, because when there's an abundance of nectar in the summertime, worker bees don't live as long as they do in the winter. So if you threw this supply of nectar at them, and they're there just to serve the needs of the hive, and the hive suddenly has this huge oversupply of nectar, it could deem them all redundant. So that's perhaps why the workers have to go back out and start working again at the end, because they haven't learned how to live as individuals whose lifespan is not entirely determined by the needs of the hive.